Hey, welcome back to the Better Not Bitter podcast. I have a new guest with me. She's been here before, but we're going to talk about something fresh with a different perspective, probably than you've already heard about it, the movie Encanto. So without further ado, we're going to drop this intro and get right into it.
Are you picking up what I'm putting down? I'm on a mission, hoping my line of vision. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? I'm on a mission, hoping my line of vision.
All right, so as I said before, I have a guest with me. She has been here before. She knows the ropes. And today we're going to be talking about the movie Encanto, the Brunos, if you will, of chronic illness with the one and only Dr. Karen Thames. Welcome.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here and being able to talk about this stuff.
Thank you for being here. I'm super excited. For those who don't know, Dr. Karen is a gem. She is a licensed professional in the area of mental health. So I thought, who better than to bring on this particular episode than someone who knows exactly what they're talking about?
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
All right. So just a disclaimer, if you have not seen Encanto, I'm not responsible for any spoilers. So without further ado, Dr. Karen, you've seen the movie Encanto. Let's kind of break down some of the bigger themes in this movie. If you will, just highlight a couple that stood out to you.
Yeah. First of all, I love this movie. I have to admit that my family and I have probably seen it about 10 times. And there's always stuff to unpack every time. You know, I'm the one that's in there psychoanalyzing everything. So it's been quite a journey, you know, just having these discussions and everything. But, you know, one of the things that stood out to me was how every character in the movie grappled with some issue that was personal to them. And I think oftentimes in the chronic illness community, we have so many commonalities and so many things that we can relate to each other about. But there are also like personal internal things that we grapple with based on our own personal histories and our stories, because each one of us has a story to tell, right? I mean, we come from different backgrounds, different families of origin, and that helps to inform the way that we sort of have this window into life, as well as a mirror about how we see ourselves and what is reflected and bounced back to us. So, I'm hoping maybe we can dig into some of the characters and some of the issues that they dealt with and how we can relate to some of that.
Yeah, that is such a awesome synopsis. I was in conversation with a friend of mine, and they were like, "Who's your favorite character?" And I couldn't pick necessarily a favorite character because I saw parts of myself in each one. Like if you look at Abuela, one of the things that held the family together, but later was a detriment to the family, was her proclivity to control and her proclivity to not letting go of the people that she loved. And later on, when you look at the movie, there's a part in there where there's this montage and it shows the backstory of how Abuela lost Abuelo, which was her husband. And through that montage, you can kind of see how going through a trauma like that would cause someone to hold on so tightly to everything and everyone that she loves. And so, just looking at that, I saw myself in that, like holding on so tightly to the former version of myself, pre-chronic illness, or at least pre-awareness or pre-progression of those chronic illnesses, like holding on to the Mayia that could play basketball and jump on trampolines and do everything like an octopus at all times. And now I have to delegate spoons according to what matters most from moment to moment. So I saw myself in Abuela because there are many areas of my life where I have a proclivity to control.
Wow. That just sent chills up my spine. I'm telling you, that is so powerful. One of the things that I tell my clients, and it's something that I'm working on myself to this day, is releasing and letting go and acknowledging the level of control that we sometimes feel that we need to survive. And when you have gone through the trauma of acquiring a chronic illness or multiple chronic illnesses, especially because we have layers of trauma. So we have the layer of trauma that involves chronic illness itself, but then we have our backstories that predated our chronic illnesses that also add a layer. So there's so many things that contribute to this need to control. And it's the thing. See, I won't even call it a weakness, because in so many ways they were strengths. It was a way to survive a lot of the things that we've been through. And so when you have that survival mechanism that is the very reason why you're here today, of course, ironically, why would you let that go? But at the same time, holding on to that in such a way that doesn't allow for you to evolve or grow, like you said, can be so detrimental.
Yeah, you preached on that. And as someone who talks a lot about mental health, I am a practitioner of someone who focuses on my own mental health, i.e. therapy, embarking on the journey of self-care, all of that. And I remember being in a therapy session, and my therapist, I was talking to her and I said, "Hey, I noticed that when I'm in these types of circumstances, this is the reaction that I end up feeling." And she said something profound to me. She was like, "You have to understand that, one, the defense mechanisms that you developed as a result of trauma, they're not necessarily bad, but you have to recognize that you don't need those anymore. Like, you're now not in that same situation where you need to have that defense mechanism. Now you have the tools to handle that from a healthy perspective. And so just telling yourself like, okay, you know what, there was a time when I needed to, display anxiety and as a result, respond and react and get in a protective mode. But now I don't need to do that. Now I can breathe. I can take time to process what just happened. And then I can respond appropriately because now I have the tools to know that those are the more healthy steps that I can take.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel like we talked a lot about Abuela in that little bit.
That's right. I mean, that was a very prominent character in the movie, and I think something that so many of us can relate to.
Yeah. And speaking of prominent characters, the main character, the heroine, the focal point of this movie, if you will, Mirabel.
Yes.
One of the things that I noticed and I saw of myself in her is her tendency to serve everyone else, which service is a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I my life is based on serving others, but she focused so much on serving others, and she never really took the time to see what value she had in her life. So she was focused on, wow, even in the intro song, like, look what my abuela can do. Look what my cousin can do. Look what my mom and my dad and my uncle and my aunt, look what they can do. But it's almost like you could tell she never really took time to acknowledge the skill set that she had because she was so focused on the fact that she didn't have a gift or that her gift didn't come from the same source that everyone else's did. And with chronic illness, sometimes we can be like, wow, look at this person who's an advocate, or look at this person without a chronic illness. Look at what they can do. But we never really allow ourselves to acknowledge that even just as we are with our symptoms, we might just have something to offer.
Yeah. Wow, that is such a powerful point. I mean, this is incredible because I love talking about this because, you and I have talked about how we don't tend to talk about these issues even within the chronic illness community, right? Because part of our survival has been to almost hyper focus on the physical or medical, terminologies and symptoms, and we speak medicalese and all of this.
Yeah.
And then we neglect the, psychological aspects. So I am loving this conversation. But Maya, you're so right. I mean, you are absolutely right that, we can tend to look at everyone else and what's going on with them and what they're able to do. And as a result, sometimes it can sort of even like magnify our own limitations. And like, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think it's important to understand, limits in terms of like looking at them as boundaries. Okay. What am I able to do from day to day? And that is a healthy way of looking at it. But if we're looking at it as a way of, dehumanizing or putting ourselves down, that can be very toxic. And so when we do this sort of like comparison game and we go, well, this person went through the same treatment as me, and yet they're so much further along, for instance, then, wow, that can really play some heavy mind games with yourself. I mean, it can make you feel pretty low.
Yeah, you said a lot there, especially when you talked about the mind games it can play. And I think one of the things I've learned about anxiety in particular, it, at least in my life, I can't speak for everyone else, but it has a way of magnifying the things that are not as important and minimizing the things that are, or minimizing the things that true. So, magnifying, oh man, I can't drive, but I'm super late because my ride was late. Everybody's going to think this of me. And so now at least in my experience, my heart is beating, I'm sweating a little bit, I'm frustrated, I'm mad at myself, even though it was beyond my control. Yeah. When in actuality, what was true, I did everything I could. And so anxiety has a way of taking something or a situation and magnifying the inequalities or the things that aren't true or the things that we don't have control over, and minimizing the things that we do have control over and the truth of that certain circumstance.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is a great point, because what we want to do is we want to elevate the things that, you know, are part of our strengths, and, you know, give less power to the things that we feel are outside of our control that drive us crazy. But there are times where we can tend to do the opposite. So it's very important to be cognizant of those things.
Yeah, you were so right. So earlier, you know, that what you just said kind of ties in with this next character, and you mentioned her earlier as Peppa, Mirabel's aunt. Do you mind talking about some of the things that you noticed with her as it relates to chronic illness?
Oh, yeah. So this is a big one, The suppression and repression of our experiences and our emotions. And, you know, one of the things that stood out at me about Peppa, it was interesting how she, for lack of a better phrase, wore her emotion on her sleeve, right? So I was that person who, like, growing up, you know, people call me the crybaby of the family, okay? I'm just gonna say that out loud. People are like, why are you always crying? And so I saw that as a weakness because I was so connected. Now, of course, you know, growing up and going into my profession and continuing to evolve as a human being, I understand that being connected to self is very much so a strength. But a lot of people don't see it that way. And what was fascinating about Peppa is that, you know, she was always running from the cloud. She was always running from the emotion, even though, you know, the emotion showed up. It showed up in a very literal and physical way. You know, she controlled like weather. And yet, you know, Abuela and others were just like, okay, can you please keep that under wraps? Can you please calm that down? Because, like, we don't need to see all that. Oftentimes with chronic illness, I mean, how much are we told to not speak truth? Right down to the fact that when people say, how are you doing? For a lot of us, the automatic response is, oh, I'm fine, I'm okay. Because we're afraid that if we actually go there and say how we're truly feeling or what kind of day we're really having, it will push people away. And look, I mean, that's our reality. It has pushed some people away. You know, there are people who have walked out of my life because they could not handle everything that came with my chronic illnesses. And so that's a reality. But, you know, I always say this, suppressing your feelings, it doesn't work. Acknowledgement is so important. And you and I were talking about this one scene where, you know, there's this huge cloud over Peppa's head and it's thunderstorming, everything's out of control, and Abuela's just sitting there like, calm down, stop. And she's, you know, again, back to the control, she's trying to control everything because it's like really embarrassing, and oh my goodness, look at how this looks to everyone else. And Peppa's sitting there like, I wish I could, but I just cannot control this right now. And I found myself cracking up because I could identify myself in her so much in that moment where I'm like, people had been like, you're team too much, you're on team too much, Karen. And I'm like, look, I cannot fake it right now. Even if I try to, I'm having one of those days where I just need to acknowledge what it is that's really going on right now.
Whew, you said some amazing things. Just like the idea of emotion suppressing. And I think it's because we have an unhealthy view or unbalanced view of emotions to begin with.
Yeah.
Emotions, I like to look at them as servants, but they are
Mhm.
terrible leaders.
Wow. That's good.
And I heard that quote from someone, I can't remember. I think it was by a minister on a platform called Redefine TV. And he
Mhm.
said, emotions are great servants, but terrible leaders or masters. And that is so true, because if you ever notice, emotions can signal, okay, I'm irritated. And a lot of times when I'm irritated, okay, why am I irritated? Who am I irritated at? Why am I irritated with them? I therapize myself, because understanding where that's coming from will help me acknowledge that moment, sit in that moment, and get past that moment when it's time to get past it. And for so long, especially when I developed or progressed in my chronic illness journey, is this idea that because we talk about our symptoms, we're complaining. And so, people who have an unhealthy or unbalanced view of emotions. And then now, when someone is conveying information that will help you love them better or serve them better, that's considered complaining. So
Wow.
it's
Yeah.
kind of twofold. And I think, like,
Yeah.
at some point, we have to recognize what's going on in terms of, are we just being made uncomfortable by someone's symptomology, or are they really the nuisance? And we'll be hard pressed to find that individual's the nuisance, because someone else's pain can make you uncomfortable, even not in the context that, ooh, let me get out of this room every time they talk about their symptoms, but it can be as simple as, oh man, my loved one is hurting and I don't know how to handle that because I want to fix that, but I can't fix that.
Right. Right. That's true. I mean, and whatever the reason is for the discomfort, I think oftentimes unknowingly and unconsciously, loved ones or the people around us will project that discomfort. They're uncomfortable with the feeling that it stirs up in them for you to express or vocalize what's going on with you. And so it becomes your problem. And in actuality, it's not your issue to own in the first place. The fact that another person cannot handle your emotions is not your issue.
That was the bar. First of all. Second of all, like, you keep dropping so many gems. And even as we look at Peppa and we kind of transition to Peppa's sister, which is Mirabel's mom, who had the gift of healing people with food.
Yes.
And the reason why I bring this particular character up is, a lot of the times, like I said before, we spend so much time kind of looking at what everyone else can do. We don't realize that the wisdom that we've gained from being chronically ill, it often provides insight to people who aren't, that they never would have else had. And I think, especially if you look at like a service context, a lot of times people pigeonhole or consolidate people with disabilities and illnesses into this one category of being able to function, when that person who's who uses a wheelchair, or that individual who may have epilepsy, or that individual who might have, chronic migraine disease or lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, these individuals have a skill set that is beneficial to humanity. Some people are great at communicating. They might not be able to do something in a traditional fashion, but from an adaptive perspective, they can have access and actually help others. And so for those who don't have an illness, I think this one is mainly for, like, connect with those loved ones that you have just thought they were a nuisance, the ones that haven't reached out to you because they probably don't expect you to anymore, because so many people have walked out of their life. Like, learn to see the value in people, and also encourage those who might feel like they have nothing to offer, but you see their gifts very explicitly. Like, encourage those individuals,
Yeah. I mean, that that is a great point. Because you don't know how people are feeling. And oftentimes, and I go through it too. I mean, we talk about imposter syndrome sometimes, and it's sort of like this like cliche term nowadays, but it's so true that, there are times where we feel like very confident about our gifts and our skill sets. And then there are other times where we're like, wait a minute, because of these limitations or because of the things that are, specific to me that other people might not see, that I struggle with, like, there's no way that I have those gifts. Like, I'm just like kind of psyching everyone out. And you don't know who is feeling that way. So to be able to encourage those gifts in others, I mean, people, it's just so important. People assume a lot of the time that, for instance, because of my years of experience in the mental health field, I've been practicing for, a couple of decades. And, people assume this like, oh, Dr. Karen has it all together. She knows exactly what she's doing and all that. But there are times, especially since going on this chronic illness journey, where I do feel like an imposter. And I do even still question my gifts. I question, if I belong in the field that I'm in. And sometimes for reasons that are, again, outside of my control. Case in point, my reality is that there are days where I have had to cancel clients because of physical symptoms. And, this whole thing about pushing through, we'll touch on that later, but, that is a loaded issue in and of itself, right? Like this idea that, mind over matter, if you just push your way through. Look, there are some days I could be pushing, and no, it's not happening. And so on those days where I've had to pay attention to self, connect to self, and validate self by, unfortunately canceling a day, I have felt tremendous guilt over it and have had to self-talk my way out of that guilt and to remind myself, look, you're not an imposter. This is your reality. This is your life. You're doing the best that you can today, which is relative because your best today is different from your best yesterday and your best tomorrow. So, yeah, I mean, that is so important.
Whew. I felt that. I feel like you were talking to me on that last part. And as you kind of alluded to, the next character, I feel like out of all of them, I really connected with her on like so many levels, even just beyond chronic illness. And that was Louisa, who is one of Mirabelle's older sisters. She's the oldest of the three children. And her power or her specific gift is strength. And with her, something I noticed, one, I'm an older sibling. So it's very natural for me to be mama bearish, even down to a friend level. It's very easy for me to be going through something and be, okay, I'm going to figure it out. I'll be fine. You know what? We're just going to press on. I see someone else struggling. Okay, let me focus on their struggle. And over the years, I've had to be really intentional, especially with chronic illness, about what to say yes to, what to say no to, how I allocate my spoons and my time. But one of the things I noticed about Louisa specifically that relates to chronic illness is she has a song in the movie called Surface Pressure. And if you haven't heard it, it's a powerful song, especially when you just take time to listen to the lyrics. And in it, she talks about how even though on the outside, she may be muscular and she's carrying people's animals and herding them back where they need to be and fixing this and holding that and lifting this for everyone else, she talks about the fears and the anxieties and the pressure to maintain all of that, that she experiences internally. if you can, Dr. Karen, could you talk about that kind of pressure and how it relates to chronic illness?
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think that she is one of the characters that I identify with the most. And that's because even, before chronic illness, you know, there was so much pressure to appear strong. Like I said, crying was considered a weakness growing up. And so presenting a certain way, like you could deal with everything in life, was looked upon pretty, in high regard. And so when I think about Louisa and how she felt that pressure to appear strong, I mean, to the point where when she was, sorry for the spoiler for those of you who have not watched the movie, but when she was losing her powers and she came into the realization that she was losing her powers, she literally freaked out. I mean, she was just falling apart because the idea of not being strong enough for everyone around her was just, I mean, it was daunting. I grew up in a household where in the household I was the older sibling, even though I have an older brother, but my sister and I are very close in age. We're a couple years apart, but I took my role, just like you, as the older sister, like very, very seriously. I mean, to the point to where I played helicopter mom before I was even a mom. And so that was a little annoying to my sister over the years. But I felt this pressure to like keep things together all the time. And, oftentimes I will talk to people about the roles that they played in their families of origin. And if you play that role of sort of like the glue or the thing that bonds everything together, thing that helps everything make sense in the world. I mean, when you have chronic illness, which oftentimes you can barely make sense of, I mean, outside of intellectually, when you have so many things that are outside of your control, it it can take you down this whirlwind because there's just so much pressure to hold it together. I'll just say this one quick thing too, is that one thing that I noticed about my chronic illness journey is that, as a result of treatment for like the original illness, there were like residual illnesses that came from that, right? And it's like pretty ironic because it's like most people expect you to follow sort of what we would consider a normal course of illness. So you have these symptoms, you have you seek out a diagnosis, you have a diagnosis, then you have treatment, then eventually you have recovery. But with chronic illness, it's a very fluctuating journey. And there is no return to baseline. They're really true. I mean, even if you get to what you consider your most optimal self or your best self, that person you were before no longer exists. And so it can be very, very, very challenging. So when you have this illness and then you treat the illness and then yeah, that illness might be in a better state of remission, but then now you've got all this residual stuff going on. That is very, very, very challenging to deal with because especially not only are you putting pressure on yourself, there are external pressures and there are people who are looking at you going, well, I thought you had that surgery. When was that? Back in 2011? I mean, shouldn't you be better by now? And so then you're explaining like, well, yeah, but because I had this illness, I now have high blood pressure and diabetes and this and this and this. And it just goes over people's heads. But then you start like questioning yourself, like, oh my goodness, I must not be strong enough to do this whole thing. Like, what's wrong with me that I can't hold it together and be back to baseline?
Whew. You said it. You said it. You said it all. And even that last part, what that last statement is so telling, and it kind of helps kind of lean into this next character. It's what's so wrong about me that I can't hold it together. And this particular character is the other older sister of Mirabelle, and that's Isabel. Her gift was making things grow, but the way that she makes things grow is very nice and polished and very succinct, like it had to be in this box. And so she essentially struggled with perfectionism. And let me be 100 with y'all. At first, she got on my nerves the first time I watched the movie. I'm being honest. But the second or the third, or I've watched it a lot at this point. But as I began to watch it, the more I began to see myself in her, because perfectionism is something that I struggled with pre-diagnosis, but it got magnified post-diagnosis. And what I mean by that is like I started to notice like my ability or lack of ability to do things the way I used to be able to do them, like laundry or even cleaning, showering, all of that. Like I couldn't do it in the same fashion that I did before. And not only could I not do it the same fashion, I realized I took those things for granted. So now it's like life flipped up on its head and I got to adjust all of a sudden. And so that pressure to figure it all out, despite not having a blueprint for this journey called chronic illness, the pressure to figure it out, find the answers, when a bunch of people are asking you questions and providing you with unsolicited advice and random medication, suggestions, like it's pressure to hold it together. Like some days you want to snap at people. Some days you want to be like, give them grace. And it's the pressure to hold all of that. It's like, you ever seen that sculpture of the Atlas where the man is holding up the world? Chronic illness is like that. You're holding the world, and the world entails billions of people with issues. Chronic illness is like having so many issues in that ball, and you're carrying it on your shoulders for what seems like by yourself.
Yeah. Ooh, that imagery, that is so powerful. I mean, it resonates so much for me. I think, you and I have that in common, that, there was a little bit of perfectionism pre-diagnosis. Some of my closer friends and family will, suggest that I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but, we won't go into that. But, maybe just a tad bit. My mentor is always saying, do you think you're trying to be perfect? Let's review this. I'll be like, okay. But again, you and I have talked about this, and, we talked about this at the beginning of this podcast, that what has worked for us in terms of being a strength in the past, it no longer serves us in the same capacity. So I think in so many ways, people who develop perfectionism develop it because they feel like it's a necessity and maybe it's a part of their survival. Within the context of having a chronic illness, let me tell you how many times I have gone over my notes time and time again before seeing a doctor, because I felt like if I don't say the right thing the right way, I'm going to be minimized, dismissed, abandoned, told that I don't know what I'm talking about. And so I found myself just going over this script like, oh, if I trip over my words or say the wrong thing, then like this whole appointment is shot, or my treatment is shot, or this is my last chance to get someone to take me seriously. Even though, that might be an embellishment of what reality is. But of course, like, again, having been in a situation where it was like literally key to my survival for this physician to listen to me, that is a very, very prominent issue. And, the other thing I'll say to that is, having to be perfect in that way, just using that example, even during times where, I was just having a harder day than other times. So like, the illness that I had made it at one point, it made it so that I could like barely string two sentences together. Like it impacted my cognition. And there are times still today where I have brain fog or I have problems finding my words. Can you imagine a day like that day? A day like that where you go to see a doctor and you can barely find your words, but yet you're putting all this pressure on yourself to vocalize or verbalize things in a perfect way. I mean, that is pressure beyond pressure.
You are so right. And kind of here's a bit of an anecdotal moment. Yesterday, I went to the doctor to get a injection for pain. Now, mind you, those of you who've been listeners of the podcast for a while know I live with intractable chronic migraine disease, which means I have not had a break from migraine in almost 10 years. It's like having one continuous bout and being stuck in the attack mode for 95% of the time. And so yesterday, I'm in my appointment and I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to say. And hopefully she, interprets it appropriately. That's what I'm hoping for. So I get in there and she's like, okay, well, have you tried this? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, we can see if it works, but this is intractable. So if this is an as needed medication, then probably gonna need a lot more than most people. And so she's like, okay, and she's typing, and while she's typing, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I don't think I did a very good job like communicating and saying all this stuff to myself. And so I get in the car, and my mentor was the one who took me to the appointment, and I just had my injection for pain. And she was like, so did the injection help? And I explained to her like, it hasn't kicked in yet, and it only lasts for 6 hours. But given that I live in pain 24/7, I will take 6 hours of some sort of relief. And so she goes in the store, and I'm in the car, and I'm like frustrated with myself. I'm like, man, Jesus, I don't feel like I'm doing a good job of conveying my symptoms and how me getting this injection or this medication plays a role in it. And so I came up with this illustration while she was in the store. Mm-hmm. And I said, think of watching TV or your favorite streaming service on a particular device, any device. It can be a TV, it can be your phone, it can be your laptop. And imagine that the volume range on that device only goes from 0 to 10. Living with chronic migraine disease or any chronic illness is like being stuck on 8, not being able to change that volume from 8 to 10 or from 8 to 0. You can't mute anything. It stays at 8 all the time. And so sometimes you have to make the hard choice of, for one brief moment, can I change the volume? And for me, medication or a pain injection is like a remote. It gives me the ability to lower the volume of pain. It doesn't eliminate it completely, but for a time, I get to lower the volume of pain so that I can function or move about my day with some sort of less severity. And I explained that to her. She was like, wow, that's a great illustration.
It really is. It really is. I think so many people can relate to that, because we have such black and white thinking. Oftentimes it's like, okay, either we have severe pain or no pain at all. And so if there's an intervention, it's like, oh, it's supposed to like completely alleviate like all this pain. And it's supposed to completely, make it so that you're symptom free. But that is not the reality for us. It really isn't.
That is very true. It is not the reality. And it goes back to that illustration you gave of chronic illness not having a blueprint, not a set of treatments, not even a set definitive track for testing or diagnosis. There's so many unknowns. Like if you look at math and you have variables like X and Y and letters that represent numbers, that's what chronic illness is. A lot of letters in the equation.
Yes. That is so true.
So this next character I also identified with, which is Mirabel's cousin by the name of Camillo. And his power is, or his gift is, he can shapeshift into any individual. So in a blink of an eye, he could turn into Doc Karen. At the blink of an eye, he could turn to me. And he uses that to trick people from time to time. And it's kind of like chronic illness. I look at Camilo and I think of the parallel of masking. Like, think of how, as people with chronic illnesses and disabilities, we are very good actors. We are very good. Yes, we're very good at acting like we're fine. We're very good at acting like we're not upset. We're very good at that. And we're often very good at masking our symptoms. For many of us, if you were to tell someone, not just because of the invisible factor of our symptoms, but because we're so good at masking, most people would be surprised at just how much we go through. If we were to actually let it all hang out, you know, the stuttering, the slurred speech, the way that we sit, our posture, the slightest self-accommodations that we mask, if we were to let it all hang out, people would really see us just as we are. And I think Camilo represents that as a form of conviction, at least for me. It makes me aware, like, where am I masking? Why am I masking? Why do I feel like I gotta hide my symptoms when I didn't ask for these symptoms, but I am adapting to them just as I am? And so learning to stop accommodating people's ignorance or even their perceived ignorance, because sometimes we can project that onto people, and learning to just kind of own our symptoms. What do you have to say about that, Dr. Karen?
Ooh, you talk about dropping a bar. I mean, that's some good stuff. That is so true. I mean, that resonates, I mean, in such a powerful way. You know, I identified with that character as well. And I think many of us in the chronic illness community very much so identify with that character. I think it was really interesting how, you know, his gift, because remember, like, all these attributes were considered gifts. So they were considered things that were positive about these individuals. And oftentimes when we can mask, we're given feedback that that's a positive attribute that we have, right? People praise us for being able to act like everything is fine. We get cookies for doing it. I mean, we get praise. And there's something about that praise and about that acknowledgement that feels good. So when I think about Camilo and how, you know, it's like, it was so whimsical, and like, you know, like there was one time where he, like, you know, turned into a baby, and it was like, you know, I'm sitting there cracking up, chuckling. I'm like, oh my goodness, he turned into that cute baby. And then at the same time, he could turn into a grown adult. You know, he could turn into one of his family members, and you know, and that, yet that was considered like this great and powerful gift. And to some degree, the ability to adapt is a gift because it helps us to get through life. I mean, none of us would have survived our chronic illnesses without the ability to adapt. But adapting and masking are two different things. Adapting, the ability to move through different situations in a way where you're still standing at the end, because as many times as we fall, we get back up, let me tell you. But masking is the denial of your experience in order to fit in to that particular situation or environment. And I think about how I've done that so many times in this chronic illness journey where I'm like shape shifting depending on the situation. So like if I'm at home, look, I mean, hair is off, I'm in the bed, everything is like, oh my goodness, terrible. I'm not feeling that great. And then, you know, I might get on a Zoom or I might have an event, and all of a sudden, like, you know, I got my face on, you know, my hair on, I'm dressed well, got jewelry on, I'm able to pull myself together enough to sound well put together. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, I'm so happy that you're so much better than you were before. And 2 hours prior, look, y'all would have seen me bald headed, laid up in the bed, not doing a thing. So, the question to ask is like, am I adapting or am I masking? And really the distinction is this serving me right now? Because if I'm adapting in a healthy way, then it's serving me in the way of being able to move through, not get over, because there's implications with saying get over something, but that's another story. But you're able to move through it. But if I'm masking, that does not serve you. That does not serve you at all.
That is so true. Whew, I gotta, assess whether adapting or masking is appropriate in the situation. Wow, that's the whole word. And kind of tying into that is the next character of Dolores. Her gift was being able to hear, and I mean like Superman, hearing through walls, conversations, and there's even a part in We Don't Talk About Bruno where she drops some bars, like she literally raps. And she says, I can always sort of hear him muttering and mumbling. But she never once told anybody, except for Mirabelle in that song, that she heard all of that going on. And there's other parts of the movie where she hears pertinent information, but she never says anything. And it kind of made me think of how, as people with chronic illnesses, sometimes and many times, unfortunately, we become knowledgeable about our conditions, but even in the knowledge that we gain about our conditions, the things that we know, we're almost timid to vocalize them to other people, especially to our own medical professionals.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, Dolores hearing Bruno in the wall. Well, we know we're having this weird symptom, but we're afraid that the doctor's going to think we're a hypochondriac. If we bring up this yet another symptom to add to our supposed grocery list. So could you speak to that, Dr. Karen?
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing up so many powerful things. And I know I keep using the word powerful, but, it's so important for us to really talk about these things because we really don't talk about them. So I'm so glad you asked me that question. But when I think about her ability to hear, at such a powerful level, I think about, how that translates for me in the chronic illness journey is being in tune with self to such a sensitive degree. I mean, and I don't want to imply a negative connotation because sensitivity to self and connectedness to self is actually a strength. And the ability to be so in tune with one's body is a strength. When I think about the tragic stories about people who lose their lives, like either in emergency situations where like women have a heart attack and they wait well too late for it to be, treated and, where the person survives. Or, you hear about the childbirth stories where, women give birth and they feel like something is off with their bodies and nobody's listening, and then maybe they go, okay, well, I guess it's not that big a deal, and tragically they lose their lives. When I think about that, I think about how speaking of pressure, there's almost this pressure to not be so in tune with yourself because it is perceived a lot of the time as being psychosomatic or to a hypochondriac level or degree. And, we get frightened by that. I mean, it is frightening to even think that our medical professional could think that we're embellishing symptoms or that, we're exaggerating, what we're going through. It is very hard to feel like you're not believed. But when I think about how important it is for you to be acutely in tune with what's going on in your body, to the point of it being a relevant part of you surviving from day to day. I mean, it's so valuable, yet we don't necessarily, even within the community, outside of the community, we don't, acknowledge how important that is. We don't acknowledge how important it is to be in tune with self. I think about pain studies and how, there are studies that show that when folks are more aware, or when they're acknowledging where in their bodies the pain resides, when they're acknowledging that there's pain to begin with, it gives the pain less power. And oftentimes we're taught to run away from or avoid, even talking about the symptoms. How many people have told me, if you just stop thinking about it, then it'll just go away. And, how many times have we heard that? And I just have to laugh. It's not funny, but like when you think about how ridiculous that is, like, just stop thinking about it, it'll go away. No, because it's still there. But yet we internalize those messages. So I know I'm just, how I like to do. I ramble and ramble and ramble, but you get my point.
Yeah, but no, that wasn't rambling at all. Everything that you've been saying is so on point, and I like how you brought in the pain studies. I just learned from that. Like, and I always wondered why, when I'm like, okay, I'm in pain, I should probably rest. Like, I then allow myself to go into self-care mode, which almost puts the pain in the peripheral. But when I'm not acknowledging it and I'm trying to do the most, as we say, that's when I'm like, ooh, yeah, I did too much. And it reminds me that I have a chronic illness. So with that being said, Dr. Karen, we got the last character that we're going to mention today. And how could we not talk about the Brunos of chronic illness without talking about Bruno himself?
Yes, we have to talk about Bruno.
Yes. Even though they didn't want to talk about him in the movie, we gonna
we gonna talk about Bruno.
Yes. And so one of the many ways I connected with Bruno is all throughout the movie, as we said, they didn't want to talk about him. And a lot of it wasn't even necessarily like, don't talk about Bruno. It was this implied heaviness that stemmed down from Abuela and the situation that occurred between her and Bruno that everybody internalized as a result. And so he left because his gift was prophecy, being able to see the future in the context of this movie. And that's not popular, especially if someone is telling you what's going to happen. And if it's negative, it's not going to seem popular. And come to find out, in the song, we don't talk about Bruno, a lot of the things that happened were because of people's own actions. It wasn't Bruno's fault. Like this one guy, he was like, he told me I have a gut. And just like he said, the man grew a gut, but he wasn't eating right, probably.
Right.
And then there's another lady. Oh man, he said my fish would die the next day dead. But did you feed the fish? Like, right. Fish need to eat. So like blaming Bruno for their mishaps, their misdeeds, their afterthought. And that brings about the notion of feeling like a burden, because he internalized all of that to the point where he made himself disappear. He hid within the walls of the house, but internally, that's so, now that I get it, like internally, he internalized that feeling of being a burden so much till he hid internally within the walls of his family.
Like I like to say, you just hit me in my shondo. That just, that struck a chord.
Yeah. And when we look at chronic illness, Dr. Karen, I don't know about you, there have been many times, even to this day, where I still have to beat back that notion of, I'm not going to ask for this because I don't want to be a burden, or, oh, this is too much, let me accommodate them so I'm not a burden. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. And how often do you hide as a result? I mean, that is the most powerful part to me, is like you hide, you shrink yourself, and you hide yourself, and you minimize your own needs because you feel like you're going to be a burden to everyone else. um that just hits home so hard, especially because being a person who's been married for 20 years, I've been married for 20 years, and I've got two daughters at home. Thank you, thank you. Talk about fluctuations. You got the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. Even though intellectually I understand by now that my husband is in sickness and in health, good times, bad times, rich or poor, I understand that from an intellectual standpoint, but the psychology behind it will sometimes not allow me to fully embrace that notion that I am loved unconditionally and that I am not a burden. It can feel like, I'm taking something away from him. And then I've got my two girls, where I felt extreme and excessive mother guilt because I'm sitting there self-blaming because they have to go through this journey with me. And so there are times where, I have literally hit, like, I have literally been like, okay, I'm feeling terrible right now. Let me sit in the bathroom for, half an hour so that nobody has to deal with how bad I'm feeling right now. And yet, even if you ask the girls, they would probably say, you know what? Even if mom's in the bed and can't get out of the bed, the fact that we can just hang out as a family, because there are times we've played games from the bed, we've watched movies from the bed, that is to them an experience that they're grateful for. So that the idea that I'm a burden is a projection a lot of the time. It's a projection, but to your earlier point, there are times where we do have the voices in our lives that also project blame onto us, and make it our faults why things are not the way that they're supposed to be, or things are not going as smoothly as they want to be. So they want them to be, rather. So I think it's important for us to have our finger on the pulse, and awareness is so important. But the other word that I think of when I think about Bruno is that of denial. And how even in terms of just trauma in general and layers of trauma, but like chronic illness trauma, oftentimes denial is used as a way of coping. And it's not an adaptive way of coping, because when you deny, you're literally denying the reality that exists in the world. You're literally pointing to something that exists and saying, no, it doesn't. So as it pertains to chronic illness, we can be in this state where, we're experiencing certain things and we're not verbalizing them. We're not talking about it, to our own detriment, because we don't want to feel like a burden. And in the movie, I love the ending because ultimately they moved from denial to acknowledgement.
Yes. Mm, 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 mm. You made some very astute and powerful points, especially in the area of denial. That's one of the things I struggle with very heavy in the beginning stages of my chronic illness journey. And like, I just wouldn't acknowledge that it was impacting every area of my life because I had a chip on my shoulder from being visually impaired. I'm like, well, you know what? This chronic illness ain't gonna touch everything like my eyes do. So I'm gonna just pretend like it ain't real. And that ended up being to my detriment. And the moment that I started acknowledging it and opening up about it, it helped in terms of just this sense of wholeness. A lot of times people like talk about healing, but healing oftentimes is superficial. Like, but if you look at wholeness, wholeness has a totality, meaning that it touches every aspect of you. So the moment I started talking about it, and even now advocating from the place of talking about it and providing a platform for other people to talk about it, it brings this sense of wholeness that just as I am, meaning with all of my symptoms, which can often feel like Batman's tool belt, just like a belt of symptoms. With all of that, I can still be impactful. I can still be effective. I can still love and serve my neighbor. I can still create content. And I think talking about it and acknowledging was the first step to me learning how to live all over again.
Yeah, that is so true. That is so true. And what and it's ever evolving. You know, like you never stop, because you might get to a certain place where you are, better at that than you were before. But, something else triggers, all these internal struggles and all this stuff gets stirred up, and you're having to work through it again and on a different level. So it's like an onion. There's so many layers to it.
Yeah, and I think not beating ourselves up for the layers. Like I've noticed that it can be easy to do that. Like, man, I thought I just worked on this. Like,
right.
I thought I went from math 101 to math 102. I thought I was fine. So just learning to not beat ourselves up for the layers. And, when we look at the context of Encanto, how it ends, like you said, they acknowledged and they were able to rebuild the house. They were able to get past it, but they were able to grow from it, all because of acknowledging it, talking about the Brunos, talking about the trauma, being open and honest, and not projecting blame onto other individuals and not projecting pressures onto other members of the family, and also acknowledging that everybody has a gift. And so I think all of those lessons from Encanto really translate well in the world of chronic illness.
Yeah. And it took taking Bruno from behind those walls for the healing to begin.
Whew, you better say it again for the people in the back. Say it again.
Look, it took taking Bruno out from behind those walls where he was in a hidden place for the healing to begin.
See, that is so beautiful. That is so beautiful. So as we close, this is again a special event. So there's no bitter or better not bitter question at the end. But to end us off, I just want to say thank you to those who listen on the live version, on the replay. Thank you to Dr. Karen for your time. And if you guys want us to do, I guess, another chronic illness review of another movie or song or something, just, let me know. You can type it in the comment section. You can find my email on my website. You can reach out to Dr. Karen. And before we close, Dr. Karen, do you have any final words for us?
Yeah, I just want to encourage you to continue the journey in love and grace, grace towards self, because, ironically, even in the midst of, thinking about this current podcast, we might have the tendency to go, man, I missed the mark because I'm not doing A, B, C, and D. But I want you to remember that, grace is just allowing yourself the flexibility to grow and to learn. And you know what? You are a true warrior. I'm just so blessed to be here with you, Mayia. And I hope that we can do more of these in the future. But I encourage all of you to just, keep it up, keep up with the journey. And you're amazing.
Thank you for your kind words. And without further ado, y'all, remember to be better and not bitter, one day at a time. And I will catch you next month. Bye.